MIT this past spring, and some of the materials that will be available for anyone in the world to use in the future related to this class are not available yet, but I can make sure that Eduardo passes along the internet connection when they do go up onto what MIT calls open courseware.
Is it this?
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I'll show you the film first. It's not connected though, Eduardo.
Yeah. You'll say we're spinning.
If you can hold him.
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
5 minutes. Yeah.
Anyway, this project at MIT was inspired in part by the work that I've been doing here in Portugal on the Foz do Iguaçu Railroad, because this was one of the first experiences that I had as a historian, an economic historian, to work directly on a research project with engineers, even though I teach at a school that has more than enough of its own engineers. And one of the things that I've learned from the Foz do Iguaçu project is that trying to recreate a past technology can actually be very instructive in helping us to understand how innovation for the future takes place. And so the idea of the course that I'm going to tell you a little bit about, and that there's this nice short movie about, was to allow a small group of students to actually try to build a printing press, a handset printing press, more or less with an 18th century design, although not that different from the press that Gutenberg first perfected for the publication of the Bible in the 15th century. And our thinking was that if students had to actually put this together themselves, there would be two outcomes. One, they would have a much greater appreciation for the actual technical expertise of people in the past, and not just their own technical expertise. And secondly, that MIT would have a handset printing press that students could then use, or faculty could use in other classes. So our goal was really twofold: to work with a group of students that were actually going to build the press, but also to create a resource that would remain on the MIT campus so that other faculty teaching other kinds of courses would be able to utilize the press. And we had in mind literature courses, or theater courses, or music courses, or indeed even engineering courses if they wanted to think about metal alloys and think about casting type. Right, there were all kinds of possible future applications. So why don't we show the film? We'll say a little something about the class, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the experience of teaching it and what I think it can help us to learn about.
Books are more than just empty vessels that contain information. The way they were made tells us not only about technology and fabrication, but it also tells us about the users, the people who read them. And so in a historical sense, it's an incredibly important set of insights into the cultural and intellectual and social history of the period that we're studying with students.
If you really want to understand the kinds of things that have shaped the human experience, they're never just of one type. They're never just physics, or chemistry, or history, or literature. They're going to be all those things put together. And this class has offered our students, I think, a very tangible example of those boundary crossings at work.
So there are three kinds of experiences that we have built into the syllabus for our students. The first is a typical set of discussions that we have in a history class. The second part of the class that we've built in is the contact with the historical material, going to the Rare Books Library, going to the MIT Museum and seeing the maps and engravings that are several hundred years old. The third part, if we think about this as mens et manus, hand and mind, is the hand part. And there what we've asked the students to do is work in the hobby shop to build a replica of an early modern printing press, and also to experiment with the manufacture of paper.
So in order to build the press, we needed to come up with an appropriate design. We had made the decision that it would be made out of wood. The wood itself was kind of interesting because we were reclaiming a timber from an old mill building in Clinton, Massachusetts. So it was all what's called longleaf hard pine. These are very large pieces of wood, 10 by 14s in cross section. So the first thing that we did was to saw it up on the bandsaw and then surface it on the joiner and the thickness planer into the dimensions of the pieces that we wanted.
Most people here find it really exciting to not just get to learn about something, but to build it and to make it happen and to get to the point where there are problems with it and have to problem solve.
I very much see the value of having the students actually work with some craftsman's tools and to develop some appreciation for what it means to take a full beam, a log as it were, and turn it into pieces of wood that can be put together in a way that is stable enough to manage the pressure of actually dropping a heavy weight onto a platen so that an impression can be made. And until they actually try this themselves, I think it's very difficult for them to appreciate what's involved.
There are tremendous misconceptions about how things are made. And the good thing about this is you really take them through the whole process, and they really have an understanding after it's done of what's involved as opposed to what you imagined was involved.
I think MIT students have an interest in preserving good forms of old technology and not just moving forward without looking back at what was good about the past. And being able to engage with history in the same way is really powerful for students here.
More and more of the students who come here have interests beyond the lab, beyond the virtual world, and are able to engage with some of the deepest and most profound questions in humanistic study. They are not only builders, but they're artists as well. It's this rounded student whom I knew would have a wonderful time with this class and whom I knew I would have a fantastic time teaching. And that's the way it's played out.
They documented the course from the start to the finish. When we began this course in February, of course, we had no idea whether we would actually build a working printing press. I'm happy to say that we have, and we've printed with it. And one of the pieces that I actually want to talk about today was the paper, because one of the things that we discovered as we began reading the historical sources that none of us had realized before was that the actual bottleneck for the original Gutenberg press was not the press, but it was the manufacturing of paper. And this was a surprise to all of us reading the historical materials, but in fact, Gutenberg went bankrupt more or less within 6 months after finishing his first press run of 2,000 copies of the Bible. And the reason he went bankrupt is because he couldn't sell the Bibles fast enough to recoup the loan that he had taken out, not for the building of the press, but for the purchase of the paper. And Gutenberg actually died in poverty, not as a printer, with somebody else running the print shop that he had created. And I think when the students began to read about this part of the narrative, they said to us, we should make paper. And that had not been part of our original plan. And I actually brought along, I'll pass them around here. Feel free to open them up. I brought along some of the paper that we ended up creating. This took the entire semester. It became a side project of the course. And one of the things that I wanted to say to you all is that when you're teaching in this mode, I think you have to be open to modifying the plan for the semester to see what kinds of opportunities will present themselves. Because the paper making, once we realized that the financial bottleneck for Gutenberg was the paper, of course we wanted to try it. And it turned out to be much more difficult than we imagined. We began with cotton rag. In fact, Gutenberg would have been beginning with linen rag and not cotton. There wasn't enough cotton being worn in Europe in the 15th century to actually make cotton paper. But we began with some old sheets and some old shirts that we collected from among the group. That's why they're the funny colors that they are. And we actually worked at breaking them up, boiling them in my kitchen for, well, more or less about a month. I had pots of fermenting rags on my kitchen stove. And we built a mold and decal, which is the way paper was formed in the early modern period, and we actually began this paper making process. And we did successfully print on the paper. Unfortunately, the students took all the samples of our printed work, and I realized when I was packing this to bring that I didn't have any with the printing on it. But in fact, the paper that we made took the print beautifully, much better than the paper that we had purchased at the art store. And for the students, I think, actually trying to make something that they thought of as simple as paper, and discovering that it involved chemistry and physics and patience, and a lot of techniques also that we normally use in the kitchen, that we think of as completely ordinary and not innovative, that this was a really important part of the learning process of this course. So the printing press lives on. It's going to be housed in the MIT library. Within another month or two, there are actually going to be mechanical plans for the press that we built that are being produced right now by a mechanical engineering undergraduate. And those are going to be available, as I said, at the MIT OpenCourseWare site. So if there were anyone in the world who wanted to replicate this experience with students, it should be relatively straightforward to do, as long as you have a good wood shop, which MIT does. Fortunately, we were able to utilize that resource. But let me just say a few final things to put this into a context of sort of hands-on learning. Approximately 80%, so 4/5 of all MIT undergraduates will do some kind of undergraduate research during the 4 years for a normal undergraduate degree. And typically what happens in one of those research settings is that they will work alongside a professor on the research that the professor is currently working on, whatever that might be. And what we wanted to do with this course was something a little bit different. Rather than having 1 or 2 students work with us on a research project that we're engaged in, which in our case as historians might mean going to the library, we wanted to actually structure an entire course around a hands-on experience that would be something they could create. And so we gave them more or less free rein to design the printing press in whatever way they thought best. And we visited a couple of working presses in the Boston area so that they could see one in action before they actually began to draw up plans. And so our goal was really to give them the opportunity to set the parameters for the full research experience, rather than just having them come to work for us on something that we were already working on. And I think for the students who took the class, and for the students who will use the printing press in the future for other classes, this is yet another kind of hands-on education on beyond just assisting a faculty member with their own research. And I have to say that for my colleague and I, teaching it, this I think is the most fun I have had in 25 years of teaching. Because every day when we would get together and meet, we were never quite sure where the class was going to end up. And we modified the syllabus probably 10 or 12 times over the course of the semester. So it was a little hard to keep track of. But I felt like for the students and for us as the faculty, the whole project was in motion all the time. That we were experimenting together, and we were exploring together, and we were finding out what was important and what wasn't important together. So that by the end of the semester, the syllabus was not just what my colleague and I had envisioned in advance, but it really had become what the students had made in collaboration with us together. And so I like to think of this as a potential spur for them to be innovative, like Gutenberg was, terribly important. But I also think that it was innovative in terms of its pedagogy, what we were actually doing in the classroom. And I think for the students it was a really amazing experience, and definitely one that I hope to replicate as well. So I think I'll stop there.
No, we don't stop there.
Don't stop there.
Tell us a few more things.
Okay.
Who were the students?
Sorry. Yeah.
Second, okay, how did you grade the students? And third, did you really do any research?
I did a lot of research to make paper, let me tell you, Eduardo. Okay, so who were the students? This course was open to any MIT undergraduate to sign up for. We obviously couldn't take very many students.
Undergrads.
Undergraduates. They were all
Undergrads.
and they were all.
I would stress.
They were all 4 years. So two of the students were were first-year students. 3 of them were seniors, and all the others were in between. I'm sorry? Yeah, 17 to 21, probably, something like that. There were no prerequisites. They did not have to have experience already working in a wood shop. I think we had 1 student in the class who already had worked in the hobby shop, but all the rest had come to the class with no woodworking experience whatsoever. Probably a third of them were computer science majors, and that's pretty typical. A third of all MIT students are computer science majors, so I would, that was completely normal. One of them is a humanities student. She's going to graduate school next year at Harvard in the history of science. So really, we had the whole gambit. We began with students who didn't really know anything about what we were doing. And I have to say, in terms of the paper making, the paper making really required experience working with textiles, and the only person who had any experience working with textiles was myself. The students were completely unfamiliar with textile construction. They knew nothing about spinning or weaving, right? So the paper making process is essentially that you take materials that you've already put together and then you work on taking them apart. It's the destruction phase, right, for the fibers. And I would say for that we did a lot of research. I learned the difference between sodium bicarbonate and sodium carbonate. That's for sure. Terribly important if you're... So I learned a little bit of chemistry along the way, which was good for me. Okay, but you asked...
Did you publish papers?
Did we publish papers? We haven't, but who knows? Maybe I'll write my memoirs someday. publishing, though, to Eduardo's question, as I say, we have hired a mechanical engineering student to actually formally publish the plans retrospectively for the printing press that we built. So that will be a research outcome, if you will.
The grading.
Grading, that was the other one. So the grading for this course actually had 3 parts. One portion of the course was, in some sense, a traditional history class. We had them read texts about early printing, about early readerships, and we had 2 units in particular. We looked at the Reformation and the impact of the printing press on both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So they had sort of a historical subject with historical sources that they were required to read and write papers about. The other unit that we did was on the scientific revolution and the impact of the printing press on disseminating new visions of the cosmos. In particular, we looked at some of the early printed copies of Galileo's work and Kepler's work and Tycho Brahe. And so we had 2 sort of historical units for which the students wrote 2 major papers. And we graded those papers exactly the way we would grade a paper in any other history course. Then we also gave them a sort of workshop participation grade, and basically, if they met their commitment to be in the workshop when they were supposed to be, they received full credit for that. We did not evaluate them on the skill of their woodshop workmanship. And then the third piece of the grade for this class is that we did work in the museum, working with artifacts, and the students also had to make a presentation about an artifact. Each student had to make a presentation. So there were a variety of sort of testing, if you will, metrics. But I still feel a little uncomfortable with the grading, and I think there were a few students whose papers weren't as good, but I think they felt like they had been shortchanged because they had worked so hard on the press. So it's definitely the grading is a tricky question for a class like this.
Okay, thank you very much. And